Elizabeth Taylor stopped mid-sentence. Her hand rose to cover her own mouth. Her eyes filled instantly, and then her whole body seemed to fold inward, her shoulders shaking, a sound escaping her that the studio audience had never once heard from the most composed woman in Hollywood. And Rock Hudson, a man who was privately dying and had told almost nobody, was on his feet before Johnny Carson had even fully registered what was happening, moving toward her with a tenderness that revealed something about him the entire country would not understand for several more weeks. Wait, because what Rock Hudson said to Elizabeth Taylor in the next 90 seconds, and what the country would learn about him only weeks later, would eventually change the entire course of a global health crisis, though not one single person in that studio, including Elizabeth Taylor herself, fully understood that yet. Before we go further, 10 seconds. Check if you're subscribed. Some of you aren't, and don't even know it. It costs nothing. It means this story finds you the moment it's ready. Thank you for being here. Now go back with me. Not to the stage, to a film set in Rome, 1954. A young actress, a young actor. Neither one of them famous enough yet to know what fame was about to cost them, and a friendship that would outlast marriages, scandals, and eventually a secret so devastating that only one of them would live long enough to fully understand what it meant. Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson met on the set of Giant in 1955, and according to nearly every account given by people who worked on that production, the friendship that formed between them was immediate and considerably deeper than the ordinary professional camaraderie that develops between co-stars. Taylor was 23 years old, already a major star since childhood, carrying a specific and exhausting kind of fame that had consumed her entire life since she was a small child. Never once permitted the ordinary experience of growing up outside the total scrutiny of a studio system and a public that felt entitled to every detail of her private existence. Rock Hudson was 30 years old, a rising leading man whose career was being carefully managed by a studio system that required him, as a condition of his continued stardom, to conceal a truth about himself that, if revealed, would have ended his career instantly and completely in the specific moral climate of 1950s Hollywood. Both of them, in other words, were carrying the exact same fundamental burden, the total and exhausting management of a public self that bore only partial resemblance to who they actually were privately. And this shared burden, according to people close to both of them, was the genuine foundation of a friendship that would last, without interruption, for the next 30 years. What almost nobody outside their closest circle fully understood in the years that followed was exactly how much Elizabeth Taylor came to know about Rock Hudson's private life, knowledge she protected with an absolute and unwavering discretion that never once wavered publicly. Not during his lifetime and not for years after his death, until circumstances finally made silence impossible. Rock Hudson's studio, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, went to extraordinary lengths to construct and maintain a public image entirely at odds with his actual private life, arranging a highly publicized marriage in 1955 specifically to counter rumors that had begun circulating about him, a marriage that ended in divorce within 3 years, but that had served its intended purpose of protecting a career built on an image the studio system considered commercially essential. Elizabeth Taylor, according to multiple biographers who have documented their friendship extensively, was one of the very few people in Hudson's life who knew the full truth from relatively early on, and who never once, across 3 decades of Hollywood's most vicious gossip machinery, allowed even the smallest hint of that truth to become public through her. She attended his parties. She defended him in private conversations when other actors made cruel jokes at gatherings they assumed were safely among friends. She became, over the years, something closer to family than simply a colleague, the specific and rare kind of friend who understood completely and judged not at all. The specific dynamics of Rock Hudson's concealment deserve fuller understanding, because they illuminate exactly what Elizabeth Taylor was protecting across 3 decades of friendship. The studio system that Hudson worked within during the 1950s operated a specific and highly organized apparatus for managing the private lives of contract stars whose personal circumstances did not align with the wholesome public image the industry believed audiences required. Fan magazines were fed carefully constructed stories about Hudson's romantic life. Publicists arranged dates with actresses specifically designed to generate the appearance of conventional romantic interest. The entire machinery of 1950s Hollywood functioned, for Hudson and for a considerable number of other performers in similar circumstances, as an elaborate and exhausting theatrical production that never stopped, that continued into every interview, every public appearance, every unguarded moment that might otherwise have been witnessed by someone outside his closest circle of trust. Elizabeth Taylor, who had herself been managed and packaged by the studio system since early childhood, understood this machinery with a specific and intimate clarity that few outside the industry could have appreciated. And this shared understanding, according to people who knew both of them well, formed a considerable part of the foundation of their friendship. Two people who recognized in each other the exhausting particular loneliness of maintaining a public self that bore only partial resemblance to their actual private existence. Their friendship deepened considerably during the years following Giant's production, weathering Hudson's brief and highly publicized marriage in 1955, a union that ended in divorce within 3 years and that Taylor, according to several biographers, privately understood from its inception as a strategic necessity rather than a genuine romantic partnership. She never discussed this understanding publicly during Hudson's lifetime, maintaining, across the entire span of their friendship, an absolute and unwavering discretion about every private detail she came to know regarding his actual life, even as the Hollywood gossip machinery around them grew increasingly sophisticated and increasingly invasive throughout the following decades. Friends who observed their relationship over the years described a specific quality to the trust between them, an ease and a directness in private conversation that stood in stark contrast to the careful, managed persona both of them were required to maintain in almost every other context of their professional lives. Taylor attended Hudson's private gatherings regularly throughout the 1960s and 1970s, becoming close as well with the small circle of friends Hudson trusted with his authentic self, and on more than one occasion, according to accounts given by mutual friends after both stars had passed away, she intervened directly and forcefully when other industry figures made cruel jokes about Hudson's private life at gatherings they mistakenly assumed were safe spaces for such comments, defending him with a fierceness that left no ambiguity about where her loyalty stood, regardless of the professional or social cost such defense might carry for her own carefully managed public image. This is the friendship, 30 years deep by 1985, that existed underneath the public spectacle of two enormously famous movie stars appearing together on a Tonight Show broadcast that Johnny Carson's producers had booked simply because it made for good television, a reunion of two giant co-stars discussing their decades-long careers. Nobody on the production staff understood walking into that broadcast that Rock Hudson was carrying something considerably heavier than either of them had ever discussed publicly, something that had only been confirmed by his doctors a matter of weeks earlier, and that this particular broadcast would become, entirely by accident, one of the first times millions of Americans would see, without yet understanding what they were seeing, the actual physical toll of a disease that had barely entered public consciousness at all. Quick reminder before we continue, because what happens next matters enormously. If this story has you hooked, take a second to hit that like button right now, and if you haven't subscribed, this is the moment, because what unfolds on that stage in the next few minutes changed more than either of these two people ever anticipated when they walked out from behind that curtain. By the summer of 1985, Rock Hudson had been diagnosed with AIDS for approximately 1 year, a diagnosis he had disclosed to almost nobody, understanding correctly that public knowledge of his condition would trigger a reaction from the American press and public that, given the widespread ignorance and fear surrounding the disease at that time, would likely be devastating both personally and professionally. He continued working, continued making public appearances, and continued the same exhausting management of public perception that had defined his entire career, except that now the stakes of that management had become considerably higher, and the physical toll of maintaining it, given his rapidly declining health, had become considerably harder to sustain. Elizabeth Taylor knew. She had known for months, one of a small handful of people Hudson had trusted with the truth, and she had spent those months doing everything within her considerable power and considerable resources to help him access the best possible medical care available at a time when treatment options for AIDS were extremely limited, and the medical establishment itself was still developing basic understanding of the disease. When Hudson's representatives arranged for him to appear alongside Taylor on The Tonight Show that July, ostensibly to promote a joint appearance discussing their shared history on Giant, Taylor agreed immediately, understanding, according to people close to her, that Hudson wanted one more opportunity to appear publicly beside his oldest and most trusted friend while he still had the physical capacity to do so. What she did not fully anticipate, walking onto that stage, was exactly how close to the surface her own carefully managed composure actually was, or exactly how much watching his visible physical decline over the preceding weeks had already been quietly wearing on her. Because what happened in the first several minutes of that broadcast, before the moment of her actual collapse, reveals something about the specific and devastating gap between what Elizabeth Taylor's public composure still suggested and what she had actually been privately carrying for weeks. The broadcast began with warm, easy conversation between Taylor and Hudson, both of them reminiscing about the production of Giant 3 decades earlier, their genuine affection for each other visible and completely unguarded in a way that delighted the studio audience. What almost nobody watching understood was that Elizabeth Taylor had, only days earlier, learned privately from a mutual friend the specific severity of what Rock Hudson was actually facing, a confirmation of fears she had been quietly carrying for months as she watched her oldest friend grow visibly thinner and more fatigued at every private gathering they attended together. She had not yet found the words to discuss it directly with him. She had agreed to this broadcast believing she could simply enjoy one more warm public afternoon with him, performing the easy, practiced nostalgia that decades of joint interviews had made second nature to both of them. Johnny Carson, unaware of any of this private context, simply experienced the broadcast as a warm and engaging conversation between two beloved stars, continuing to ask questions about their shared history with the genuine curiosity and warmth that had made him the most trusted interviewer in American television. And then, roughly 11 minutes into the segment, Carson asked a question that he intended entirely innocently, wondering aloud whether the two of them ever thought about growing old together as friends, still trading stories about Giant decades into the future. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Elizabeth Taylor's composure, legendary and unshakable across 4 decades of public scrutiny, broke completely and without warning. Her hand rose to cover her own mouth. Her famous violet eyes filled instantly, overflowing before she could stop them, and her shoulders began to shake with a specific and unguarded grief that the studio audience had never once seen from her in any previous public appearance. A sound escaped her, half gasp and she turned her face away from the camera, her entire body folding inward with the particular collapse of someone who has been holding something back for considerably longer than anyone around her realized. The studio audience's earlier warm laughter died completely, replaced by a specific and stunned silence, several people rising partway from their seats, uncertain what had triggered such a sudden and complete collapse in a woman whose public composure had always seemed absolutely impenetrable. Rock Hudson did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. Despite his own considerably diminished strength, despite a body that was, unknown to almost everyone in that room, already fighting a battle that would end his life within months, he was on his feet immediately, moving to Taylor's side with a gentleness that revealed a tenderness the public rarely associated with his more traditionally masculine screen persona. He knelt down carefully beside her chair, his own movements betraying a stiffness that would only make sense to the country weeks later, and he took her hands in both of his, and he said, his voice carrying a specific quiet steadiness that the boom microphones captured with complete clarity, "Elizabeth, look at me. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere yet." This detail, the specific phrase "yet," tucked almost invisibly into an otherwise ordinary reassurance, was noticed only much later by people who reviewed the footage after his diagnosis became public, understood in retrospect as the quiet, devastating truth of a dying man comforting his oldest friend while carefully withholding, in that exact moment, the full weight of what he already knew about his own limited remaining time. The choice of that single word deserves a moment's further reflection, because it captures something essential about what genuine friendship sustained across decades of public performance ultimately makes possible even under the most impossible circumstances. Rock Hudson, at that exact moment, was privately carrying a diagnosis that would become one of the most consequential disclosures in American cultural history, and rather than allowing his own fear to occupy the room, he set it aside entirely without a single visible trace of hesitation, in order to hold his dearest friend together during her own unexpected moment of collapse. He did not know, sitting there with her hands in his, exactly how much time he actually had left. But he knew with complete certainty that the woman in front of him needed him more in that specific instant than his own fear needed acknowledging, and he gave her, without reservation, every ounce of steadiness he had left to give. Hudson's breathing, gradually, began to steady, his eyes fixed on Taylor's face with an expression of visible relief and visible gratitude that needed no additional words to communicate. Johnny Carson had risen from behind his own desk, genuinely alarmed, immediately signaling toward the wings for medical assistance. But something in Elizabeth Taylor's total and complete command of the situation told him, with the specific instinct that had made him the most trusted host in American broadcasting, that whatever was happening was already being handled by exactly the right person. The specific medical reality Rock Hudson was navigating during this period deserves careful and fuller documentation, because it explains exactly why his collapse on that stage carried such genuine physical danger. AIDS in 1985 remained a poorly understood and extremely poorly treated condition, with the specific antiretroviral therapies that would eventually transform the disease into a manageable chronic condition still years away from development or widespread availability. Patients diagnosed during this period faced not only the direct physical toll of the disease itself, the progressive weakening of the immune system that left the body vulnerable to a cascade of opportunistic infections, but also the specific and considerable additional burden of navigating a medical establishment that was, in many documented instances, poorly equipped or, in some deeply troubling cases, openly reluctant to provide the same quality of care that patients with other serious illnesses could expect to receive without question. Rock Hudson, despite his considerable wealth and his considerable access to some of the best medical care available in the country, still faced genuine and significant challenges in accessing experimental treatments, a difficulty that Elizabeth Taylor, using her own considerable resources and her own extensive personal connections, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to help address in the months before that broadcast, arranging consultations with specialists and advocating directly, in ways that were never publicized at the time, for her friends' access to whatever emerging treatment options existed. This private effort, largely unknown even to many people close to both stars until biographical accounts were compiled years later, meant that Elizabeth Taylor walked onto that Tonight Show stage already carrying a specific and intimate understanding of exactly how serious her friend's condition actually was, an understanding that made her instantaneous response to his collapse considerably less surprising in retrospect than it appeared to the millions of viewers who had no context for what they were witnessing. What followed was not, in any conventional sense, entertainment. Production staff, understanding the genuine seriousness of the moment, quietly cut to an unscheduled commercial break, and what happened during those minutes off camera has been described, in the years since, by several people who were present, painting a picture of Rock Hudson remaining kneeling beside Elizabeth Taylor's chair for the entire break, still holding her hands gently in his, continuing to speak to her in a low, steady voice that nobody beyond the two of them could fully hear. When the broadcast resumed, both Taylor and Hudson had recovered sufficient composure to continue, though the remainder of the segment carried a considerably different quality than its earlier light-hearted tone, both of them visibly more subdued, Hudson's hand remaining protectively over Taylor's for the duration of the conversation that followed. Carson, reading the moment with the sensitivity that had defined his decades of hosting, gently steered the remaining conversation towards safer, gentler territory, allowing both performers the dignity of concluding the broadcast without further public examination of what had just occurred. The studio audience's reaction to what they had witnessed deserves fuller documentation as well, because it reveals how genuinely unprecedented this moment felt even to people who had no specific medical knowledge of what was actually happening in front of them. Several audience members interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast described a specific and unusual quality to the silence that had filled the studio during those minutes, distinct from the ordinary silence that follows a technical malfunction or an awkward pause in conversation. One audience member, a retired school teacher who had attended the taping with her adult daughter, told a reporter that she had never before witnessed, in any live television setting, two of the most famous people in the world set aside every trace of performance and simply become, in front of hundreds of strangers, exactly what they actually were to each other, frightened and devoted and completely unguarded. The production staff, reviewing the footage in the days following the broadcast, made the deliberate decision not to air the full sequence of Taylor's collapse in its original unedited form, instead trimming the broadcast segment considerably before it aired later that evening, a decision made out of genuine concern for both stars' privacy and dignity rather than any attempt to obscure or minimize what had occurred. This editorial choice meant that the full, unedited intensity of what actually happened on that stage remained known only to the several hundred people physically present in the studio that day until decades later, when surviving crew members and audience members began sharing their first-hand accounts in interviews conducted for documentaries examining the early history of the American AIDS crisis. Rock Hudson's public announcement that he was suffering from AIDS came several weeks after this broadcast, in late July of 1985, becoming one of the most significant moments in the entire history of American AIDS awareness, the first time a major American celebrity had publicly acknowledged the disease, a disclosure that fundamentally altered public perception of a condition that had, until that point, been widely dismissed or ignored by mainstream American culture and media. Elizabeth Taylor, in the aftermath of this announcement, became one of the most significant and most consequential AIDS activists in American history, co-founding the American Foundation for AIDS Research and dedicating an enormous portion of her remaining decades, along with a very significant portion of her considerable personal wealth, to funding research and advocating for compassionate treatment of people suffering from a disease that mainstream American society was, at that time, responding to with widespread fear, ignorance, and open cruelty. She said, in numerous interviews given across the following years, that her transformation into an activist began not with any single decision, but with the specific and unbearable experience of watching someone she loved as completely as she loved Rock Hudson suffer, both from the disease itself and from the specific cruelty of a society that treated people with that diagnosis as morally deserving of their own suffering. She has specifically referenced, in several later interviews, the moment of his collapse on that Tonight Show stage as one of the clearest and most painful demonstrations she ever witnessed of exactly what the disease was doing to someone she loved, in real time, in front of an audience that had no idea, in that specific moment, what they were actually watching. In the weeks between his public announcement and his death, Rock Hudson received an outpouring of support from ordinary Americans that surprised even his closest friends, thousands of letters arriving at hospitals and at his home, many of them from people who wrote that his willingness to disclose his condition publicly had given them the courage to seek testing or treatment for themselves or for loved ones who had been suffering in silence, too frightened of the specific social consequences that Hudson's own career had, until his announcement, seemed to confirm as inevitable. Elizabeth Taylor visited him regularly during these final weeks, according to people close to the family, maintaining the same steady, unguarded presence she had offered him on that Tonight Show stage, refusing, even as his condition worsened considerably, to allow the specific fear and stigma surrounding the disease to alter in any way the physical warmth and closeness that had always characterized their friendship. Rock Hudson died on October 2, 1985, less than 3 months after his public announcement, becoming in his death as significant a figure in American public health history as he had been in American film history throughout his career. Elizabeth Taylor, upon his death, gave a statement that specifically referenced their decades of friendship and the specific gift he had given her by trusting her, across 3 decades, with the truth of who he actually was, a trust she said she considered one of the most significant privileges of her entire life. She continued her AIDS activism for the remainder of her own life, becoming, by the time of her own death in 2011, one of the most widely recognized and most genuinely impactful celebrity activists in the history of American philanthropy. Work that she consistently and directly traced back to a single friendship that had begun on a film set in 1955 and that had asked her, ultimately, to become considerably more than simply a famous actress, to become, in the specific and devastating crucible of watching someone she loved suffer, one of the people who helped change how an entire country understood a disease that had for too long been allowed to remain invisible. There is one additional dimension to this story that deserves careful attention, because it connects directly to the considerably larger legacy that emerged from the private friendship between these two performers. Elizabeth Taylor's activism following Hudson's death did not remain confined to fundraising and public advocacy, significant as those contributions were. She used her considerable personal celebrity at a time when doing so carried genuine professional and social risk to appear repeatedly alongside AIDS patients in public settings specifically designed to counter the widespread fear and stigma that characterized public attitudes toward the disease throughout the middle and late 1980s. She held the hands of dying patients in hospital wards when many public figures, and indeed many medical professionals, remained too frightened of casual transmission to offer patients even basic physical comfort. She testified before Congress repeatedly, pushing for research funding at a time when the disease was still widely and incorrectly dismissed by significant portions of the American public and government as a concern affecting only a narrow and marginalized population. Biographers and historians who have studied the early American response to the AIDS crisis have specifically credited Taylor's visible, public, and sustained commitment to the cause as one of the genuinely significant factors that helped shift broader American public opinion during a period when compassionate treatment of AIDS patients was, in many parts of the country, a distinctly minority position. She said, in one interview given late in her life, that she considered this work the most important contribution of her entire career, considerably more significant to her than any film role she had ever played, and that every single time she felt exhausted or discouraged by the enormity of the task, she thought specifically about the moment on that Tonight Show stage kneeling beside Rock Hudson, holding his face in her hands, and promised herself that she would keep doing whatever was necessary to ensure that fewer people would ever have to experience that particular kind of frightened, isolated collapse in a world that did not yet know how to respond to their suffering with basic human compassion. If this story has moved you tonight, I want you to sit with something for a moment before you close this video. Elizabeth Taylor spent 30 years protecting a truth that was never hers to reveal, and when the moment finally came that her friend needed her most completely, she did not hesitate for even a single second, offering him, in front of millions of people, exactly the kind of total, unguarded presence that 30 years of genuine friendship had prepared her to give. Think about the people in your own life who are trusting you, right now, with truths they have never told anyone else, truths that may one day require you to stand up immediately and completely, without hesitation, exactly when they need you most. You do not need 30 years of friendship to begin building that kind of trust. You simply need to be the kind of person whose discretion and whose loyalty are genuinely absolute, so that when the moment eventually comes, the person trusting you already knows without any doubt that you will be there. If you have not yet joined this channel's community, please consider doing so now. The link is below, and becoming a member helps make these deeply researched stories possible for everyone who watches. Please like this video if it moved you tonight, because every single like helps this story find someone else who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already, so the next story reaches you the moment it is ready. And in the comments below, tell me, is there someone in your life who has trusted you with something they have never told anyone else? Tell me about them without breaking that trust. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, because somewhere out there right now, someone is carrying a truth they are terrified to reveal, waiting to discover whether the people around them will respond the way Elizabeth Taylor responded, with immediate, unhesitating, unconditional love.